Hello class and welcome to our lecture on identity and subgroups. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to revisit the definition of culture. We're going to talk about our cultural identity and how subgroups can be a part of our cultural identity. Specifically, we're going to go into detail about race and gender. Then we're going to talk about things that subgroups share, for example, language or argot. And finally, we're going to talk about the importance of corporate culture. This lecture is going to be a little bit longer than our other ones, so feel free to pause and take a break if needed. Okay, so let's review some of our definitions of culture all the way from chapter 1. Remember that culture is a community that's a large community. It's self-sustaining. They share things like thoughts, concepts, values, behaviors, holidays, for example. This group passes their values along the course of generations, and group membership does not have to be official, but it can be like citizenship, or you could just self-identify with the culture. Maybe you've lived in a specific culture for a while and now you identify with that group. So remember, there are 4 key elements of cultures. So the first one is symbols that represent meaning. So these are like nonverbal symbols like the American flag or the bald eagle that represent values or just meaning, like this represents the United States of America, freedom, the 50 states, for example. Rituals or cultural practices, so like holidays, for example. Cultural values, so things that aren't really discussed but are just really understood by the group, such as freedom of speech is really valued in the United States. And then cultural heroes, so these can be fictional or real people that we look up to and we want to emulate their behavior. So I gave the example of Michael Phelps in chapter 1. He would be a cultural hero because he's somebody who won 22 Olympic gold medals. He ended up going to rehab and struggling with addiction and depression, and then came back and won more gold medals. So he would be a cultural hero. All right, so subgroups are different in that they're smaller than cultures and they exist within the dominant culture. And there are many different aspects to subgroups. So subgroups can be professional or social groups, for example, your job. They could just be groups where you have shared interests, like maybe you're in a car club, for example, or on a sports team. And they could also be aspects of your cultural identity, so things like race, religion, your class, ethnicity, gender. All of those things could be part of our subgroup. And then subgroups are similar to cultures in that they provide members with patterns of behavior, shared language, and even shared nonverbal communication. And you have to be a part of that group to understand the shared language and meaning of all of the nonverbal symbols. Okay, so subgroups typically don't transmit their values or patterns of behavior over the course of generations, but they can. So for example, ethnic groups might pass along their patterns of behavior over the course of generations. But if you're in a group that's just like a sports team, then maybe you don't really transmit these values to your children, for example. So some subgroups that I have been a part of, I was not a part of AA, but I did work in treatment for drug and alcohol use disorder. And so I'm very familiar with the halls of Alcoholics Anonymous and the language and nonverbal symbols that go along with that. Other examples would be if you are in a profession where there's a lot of very specific language, like if you're a doctor or a nurse or a paramedic, then you're going to share that specific slang and jargon that's associated with that job. Maybe you have a sport that you really love, like surfing, or you live in Southern California, so that's another example of a subgroup. Or it could just be hobbies and interests, like breakdancing, for example. All right, so when it comes to our cultural identity, recall that there are 6 aspects to our cultural identity. So race and gender, we're going to get into that today. Nation or nation state, so this is typically like where you live, or it could be where you're from. Religion, class, and then civilization is kind of a broad term. We're part of a Western civilization, so we have a lot of cultural norms that come from that. If you recall, all the way back in our first lesson, I had you listen to a podcast with Amara La Negra, and she talks about her cultural identity, and she really identifies as Afro-Latina because she is half African-American and half Latina. And a lot of times people are trying to put her in specific categories but she really identifies with both. And so this is sort of an example of how she came to her own acceptance of her cultural identity and own definition of her cultural identity. All right, so identity and subgroups. So I want you to think about some subgroups that you are a part of, and then think about the elements of this subgroup. So for example, subgroups usually share things like elements of culture, so like heroes, rituals, patterns of behavior. They share things like shared values, interests, language, and nonverbal symbols. So I'm going to give you an example. Maybe you identify as part of the LGBTQ community. And so if you're going to look at the elements of this subgroup, that would tell you something about the group. For example, values and heroes. So maybe you value things like equality for all. Maybe you have a hero like Audre Lorde, as pictured here, who is a poet and author and scholar. Audre describes herself as a Black lesbian mother warrior poet. This group might also share interests or patterns of behavior. So you might strive for things like equality, civil rights. You might march in a gay pride parade, for example. And then you might also share language that's specific to the group or nonverbal symbols. So our textbook identifies the rainbow flag as being part of the LGBT community, as it was first used in a pride parade in San Francisco in the United States. Other examples throughout history would be the pink triangle, which was used in Nazi Germany to identify gay people, but has since been sort of taken back by this subgroup and now sort of worn or shown as a symbol of pride as being a part of this group. Okay, so race and ethnicity. I'm going to give you these two terms here because a lot of times people get confused about the difference between race and ethnicity. So race, according to our textbook, is a flawed system of classification created and recreated over time. So it's important to know that definitions of race have been changing and evolving throughout human history. And categories include things like skin color, eye color, hair texture to divide human populations into groups. So once divided into these groups, we then attribute qualities to people who have this particular skin color or hair texture. For example, things like your physical abilities, mental capacity, personality traits to that group. It's important to note that these categories are created by society. They're not factual and they're always changing. So ethnicity is different. Ethnicity is a sense of historical, cultural, or ancestral connection to a particular group. For example, I would identify as white. But if I really look at my ethnicity, I would identify as Italian and probably American. I actually did a 23andMe test and it came up that I'm a mix of like 13 different ethnicities. But growing up, my family really stressed Italian values. We were Catholic, we ate Italian food for all of our holidays, and then also American culture I really identify with because I was raised in the United States, share holidays with other people. We also have the same sort of origin myths or stories about our history. So ethnicity shares elements of culture as well. They also share values and even stories about how this group got started. Okay, so how is race constructed? Genetically, it's important to note that there is only one race. So it's the human race. Humans actually share 99.9 of our DNA. It's identical. So me, you, everybody, we basically share the same DNA. Skin color, eye color, things like that are only 0.1% of a person's genetic code. And as we see migration throughout history, then we see skin tones, eye color, hair color, things like that changing throughout history. And it's a very small percentage of our genetic code, which is why it's so easily mutable. So ideas of race have been constructed by European colonizers over a period of 500 years. So people in power taking land, moving to different areas, and creating these categories of race. And you might ask yourself, why would we create, or why would anyone create categories of race? usually it's served to justify takeover or to hang on to power. So in the case of colonization, we have white Europeans who are in power colonizing different areas and categorizing people into these race categories to justify the takeover. We see this in the United States with indigenous people. So categorizing them as savages or uncivilized, saying that Europeans need to come in and colonize and like make this a civilized community, justifying the takeover of their land, murder of their people, things like that. So obviously this can be a barrier to communication, and I want to give you the official definition of racism according to our book: individuals' thoughts and actions, institutional patterns, that should say patterns, and policies that create or reproduce unequal access to power, privilege, resources, and opportunities. Racism can be individualized or it can be institutional. So it could be like person to person, just communicating, you might hear racial slurs, or it could be institutional. So it could be like laws or structures of power that institute racism. For example, before 1964 in the United States, we had separation of races when it came to schools, businesses, for example, and this was institutionalized, it was legal. And then after the Civil Rights Act in 1964, we see these changes. So racism, prejudice, stereotypes can lead to things like hate speech. So this would be defined as threats or verbal slurs against specific groups of people based on observable characteristic traits, skin color, etc. And then we also have microaggressions. So these are like unintentional, sometimes everyday slights. People might not even realize what they're saying is coming off as racist. So things like, hey, you're pretty for a dark-skinned girl, or how come you don't sound white? I have a picture here that says, where are you really from? So someone might say, well, I'm American, and they would, be referring to their race and say, but where are you really from? Inferring that they're from a different country because they have a different skin color. Okay, so let's talk about identity and privilege. So let's first define what gives us privilege. And this is defined as white privilege. And it exists in the United States and other nations as well, South Africa, for example. People categorized as observably white, so like fair-skinned, have privileges and advantages, and others do not have these privileges. And it actually puts others at a disadvantage. These ideas of privilege can lead to stereotypes and prejudice, which we know are major barriers to communication. Other examples would be that lighter skin is associated with being more friendly, honest, more intelligent, more employable. The list goes on and on and on. I'm sure that you can think of some of these privileges yourself. Okay, so how does this affect our communication? People of color are likely to be more aware of race and identity, probably because they've had experience with racism or prejudice, things like hate speech, microaggressions, for example, especially in the United States. And reports show that hearing racial slurs actually lead to the person who's receiving them feeling anxious, more depressed, and sometimes even internalizing these stereotypes and starting to believe them themselves. So Dr. McPhail argues that we actually need to engage in open discussion about race. We need to talk about perceptions of race. We need to talk about white privilege in order to actually remedy these negative perceptions. So a lot of people, the argument nowadays is, I don't really see race, or I don't see color, or I don't treat people differently based on skin color. But the argument here is that if you don't actually recognize the problem, then you are erasing that person's experience. So it's better to actually recognize it and remedy it. And we can do this through our language. Okay, so now that we've talked about race, we're also going to discuss gender as it pertains to our cultural identity. The reason that we're talking about race and gender so much is these are observable traits, and so oftentimes others make judgments based on what they see. So, gender and sexuality definitely influence our cultural identity as well. And we have something called queer theory. So, we discussed earlier in the semester this sort of gender binary male, female, masculine traits, feminine traits, but it doesn't really incorporate a mixture or like spectrum of gender and the way that we express gender. So, queer theory attempts to do that and sort of expand our idea of our identity. So, developed by Western culture, queer theory challenges the concept of these binary categories that we must fit into either being male or female or showing off our gender identity as feminine or masculine. And it suggests that every part of our identity is mixed, it's fluid, it's changing. One day you might identify more as something, on another day you might identify more as something else. It also incorporates things like sexuality, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status and class. Okay, so homosexuality around the world. So Gert Hofstede studied value dimensions in cultures. And if we remember, there are some cultures that score higher in masculinity on that scale from 0 to 100. So high masculinity is actually negatively related to acceptance of homosexuality or being gay or lesbian or identifying as part of the LGBT community. If you are high femininity in your country, then you have a positive relation to acceptance of homosexuality. So I'm going to give you some examples of this in a minute. Also, highly religious cultures also have a negative association with homosexuality. So, Roman Catholic cultures, very strict Christian cultures, and Muslim cultures are negatively associated with the acceptance of homosexuality. So we see higher acceptance of homosexuality in Europe, North and South America, and lower acceptance in Africa, primarily Muslim nations like Yemen and Iran and much of the Middle East. And this was interesting. In the United States, they took a survey, 2017, I believe, and the US ranked 60% acceptance of homosexuality. Okay, so when it comes to gender and communication, remember that subgroups share things like language, and so vocabulary is always changing. There was a study in the military in the United States that asked people if they accepted or would be okay with homosexuals in the military. And then they changed the wording and they said, would you be accepting of gay people in the military? After they changed the wording to gay instead of homosexual, the acceptance rate was higher. So, indicating that language sort of influences the way that we think about things. We also see acronyms like LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning. And we also see more letters sort of adding on to this as definitions kind of evolve and change over time. So kind of be aware that the verbiage is always changing. It's okay if you don't know it all the time. And the best thing to do is ask. So barrier to intercultural communication would be homophobia. And this is a learned attitude, an irrational fear of gay or lesbian people related to heterosexual male dominance and patriarchy. So sort of this belief that heterosexuality is correct, and this irrational fear of gay people. And it is related to high masculinity, as we talked about in the previous slide. For example, cultures like Yemen, which ranks really high in masculinity, being gay, if you're out in public and people know that you're gay, it's punishable by either jail time, you could be stoned to death, you could be thrown off the top of a building. So this shows us an example of how this masculinity scale can relate to gender. Okay, so this might be a good stopping point for if you want to pause the video, and this is Jenna's Easter egg challenge or hunt. So if you want to earn some extra credit points, head to the Student Lounge discussion board. It's located at the very top of our modules section, and share with us maybe your favorite meme or GIF or just something funny. Okay, let's continue. So there are many aspects of our cultural identity and many subgroups that we could be a part of that also influence our our identity. So I'm not going to go into all of these because it could literally take all semester to do that. So just know that these are other groups that you can also identify with. And now we're going to talk about traits that subgroups have. So every subgroup that you're a part of has shared argot or language, specialized language of subgroups. So this also evolves and changes over time. When I was in college, I was in a sorority, and so I think about fraternities and sororities and all of the specialized language that they have. So this argot can also be called jargon, which is usually specific to your job, cant, or slang. So sort of words and phrases that you would only know if you're a part of that group. For example, when I was trying to join the sorority, they called it rush. So you're sort of rushing a sorority. And when I did join, I had been assigned to a big sis, which is just somebody who's been in the sorority for a year and sort of helps you like navigate your way through it. And so I think about how this like evolves and changes. Okay, so group identity is important when it comes to these groups. If you know the language, then you sort of have this shared identity. For example, I was a Pi Phi and we had songs that went along with this. The language also defines the boundaries of your group, so who's in your group and who's not in your group. And the language holds specific meaning for that specific subgroup and could mean something else to a different group. And it's not only limited to words, but it can be nonverbal communication as well. So things like handshakes, clothing, any sort of tattoos, symbols, flags, for example. The book gives examples of gangs in Los Angeles. The gang MS-13 has over 100 different hand symbols that represent meaning, and you would really have to be a part of this group to understand what the symbols mean and communicate effectively. Interestingly enough, in 2017, leaders of specific groups of the gang would wear these Nike tennis shoes. They were called the Nike Cortez, and police caught on that specific leaders were wearing these tennis shoes. And so the group had to sort of issue, I guess, like a verbal memo to not wear these shoes so that they would not be recognized by the police. Okay, so this language and group identity can be spread through things like the media. So groups use the media and social media platforms, magazines, any sort of social media like Instagram, for example, to sort of spread or propagate their values. For example, maybe you really identify with being a feminist, and so you would read Miss Magazine, which reports on gender issues. And so this was founded by Gloria Steinem, who's a feminist in the United States. You also use the media to communicate with each other, to communicate with the community at large, spread and share your ideas. And recently, Miss Magazine has created an Instagram account. So that's another way that they are sharing their values. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about today is corporate cultures, policies and procedures of businesses and organizations. So corporate cultures are really similar to cultures and co-cultures and subgroups in that they share things like symbols, heroes, myths, rituals, values, and they're cultivated within the corporation. So there might be like a company handbook, there might be like videos, training videos, shared colors. For example, if you work at Target, you're going to wear khakis and a red shirt. You know the slogan is expect more, pay less. You're there for customer service. And businesses with strong corporate cultures have been found to be more successful and have happier employees. So this is sort of one of the reasons why corporations cultivate a strong culture. You might even see things like mission statements, for example. Moorpark College's mission statement is students first. It's kind of a long mission statement, but that's the gist of it. All right, so some examples of corporate cultures. Disneyland. I had a student who worked at Disneyland and she absolutely loved it. She said that they would stress things like innovation, storytelling, and magic, and all employees at the park were seen as cast members and they were sort of contributing to the guest experience at the park. She said that they even had what was called a magic moment, and every cast member could do something special for one person every single day. So for example, if you knew that it was somebody's birthday, you might want to give them a free ice cream cone or move them to to the front of the line for a ride at Disneyland. Another example of a strong corporate culture is Google. Google is seen as a flat company as far as their management style goes, so not a whole lot of management, and employees have direct access to their CEO. So even though there are 67,000 employees, they are encouraged during their meetings monthly to present new ideas and innovations directly to the CEO. Google also offers things like free food, fitness classes, massage therapy, napping pods, even things like dry cleaning and hair salon services. So all sort of contributing to this corporate culture and identity. So someone would be really proud to work for Google. I thought this was interesting. The book gave us an example of corporate culture at Southwest Airlines. So Southwest Airlines sort of came from this idea from their CEO. He has since passed away, but when he was alive, he had this sense of humor that was self-deprecating. He's like this Texan who loved chain smoking and drinking whiskey, and he loved to have fun. And they said he would dress up sometimes as Elvis for their corporate parties. And he created this company. And his idea was you like to have fun, but you still like to get down to business, and you can travel in the Southwest area. So you can travel between Dallas and Houston, for example, using our flights. He even said that he looks for employees who have the Southwest spirit, so sort of this like spirit of customer service and like fun. And so it was an airline for people who do business in the Southwest. And some of their values were efficiency, customer service, and fun. Here's a picture of that CEO during one of his ads, sort of hanging on the wing of an airplane with no shoes on, I don't know, making a screaming face. Okay, so now let's reflect on subgroups and our cultural identity. So I want you to think of your identity as intersectional. So that means all those aspects of your identity sort of intersect or overlap with each other. Choose a few groups that you really identify with. Maybe you identify with being a woman, or you identify with your job, like I used to work in addiction treatment. Maybe you identify with your ethnicity or your geographic location. Think to yourself, is one group more prevalent in your identity? And does this change over time? For example, sometimes I really identify as an educator. Other times I might have to put on my feminist hat and go march in the Women's March. For example, after the election of Donald Trump in 2016, he was seen making sexist remarks on television, calling Hillary Clinton a nasty woman. At this time, millions of women, 2 million women in the United States, went out and marched for equality. And there were many signs, as you can see here, that said nasty woman or proud nasty woman, for example. And so at that time, maybe gender was a really important part of their identity. So think to yourself, how do I identify now, and does this shift with the day, with the week, with the month, over time, or maybe it's just situational? And then finally, I want you to think, how does your cultural identity influence your communication? Does it influence daily communication? Does it influence your verbal or nonverbal behavior? Does it influence your interaction with individuals, or your interaction with people on social media, or what you post on social media? And does it help you identify with certain groups, make friends, and communicate with certain groups of people, or maybe avoid communication with other groups of people? We're going to be talking about your cultural identity more on the discussion board this week. So these are just some things to reflect on, and then hopefully we can get together and discuss. Okay, that's our lesson for today. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.